The title of the paper is Notch Mediates Intertissue Communication to Promote Tumorigenesis, and it's going to appear in Current Biology in April online and then in May in print. And it's actually a study that's led by the postdoc who was in the lab, Hadi Burkhatni, who's now just returned to France, where he's going on to the next stage of his career, and he was a major driver in the project. When tumors are initiated, they're initiated because there's a mutation that arises in one type of tissue. But actually, for the tumor to grow, it needs to communicate with the surrounding tissues. And there's a kind of dialogue that goes on between the one that's actually genetically altered and what's really normal surrounding tissue. And our lab works on a particular cell communication pathway, cell-cell signaling pathway, which is called the Notch pathway. And normally that's actually involved in talking between cells in the same tissue, because you have to have the ligand and the receptor have to be, they're basically on the membrane, so the cells have to be in direct contact. So usually you think of signaling taking place within cells in the same tissue, really, and in the same epithelium. And so what was particularly surprising about this was, in fact, the epithelium is talking to this, what would be the equivalent of the stroma, to the mesenchyme, through this signaling pathway. So this is actually an example where the signaling is much longer range than you'd normally have expected, and actually between tissues, which is not something that's commonly been seen with that. You know, you have a particular architecture of a tissue, and those cells are very closely touching each other. And normally one thinks of signaling just occurring between those. And this is showing that, in fact, there are things that are not really so tightly organized, and you can have signaling between things that are actually, in a way, might be considered discrete tissues. I should say this actually does happen normally as well. So in the normal situation, this is going on. That's part of what's also shown here. And so the way that there's a coordination between these two tissues is actually already involving some degree of long-range signaling, although, and we can see that in some of the experiments, we can't actually visualize that quite as well as we could do in the tumors. So in a way, what the tumors do is sort of take advantage of a normal signaling process to co-opt really the adjacent tissue, and it needs that adjacent tissue in order to be able to grow. And if you actually kill those other cells, for example, which is what Hector and Steve did in their first experiment, or if you block the ability of them to receive this signal, then in fact the tumor no longer grows. So I think the sort of surprising thing is that having a cancer-driving mutation in a particular tissue is not on its own enough to drive the tumor. It's actually got to be talking to these other cells as well to sort of help sustain it.